The heat in Judge Watts's office was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from dust and stale cigar smoke. It settled on Vivian Marshall's shoulders, pressing down with the same weight as the verdict that hung over her brother's head. Outside the grimy window, the sun beat down on Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, bleaching the sky to a pale, merciless white. The rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil was the only steady sound, a constant, metallic heartbeat counting down the days until James would be marched to the gallows. 1881, a year that would be remembered in her family for nothing but the taste of ash. Vivian kept her back to the two men in the room, her gaze fixed on the dusty street below. A mule cart rattled past, its wheels churning up a fine red powder that coated everything, a permanent blush of rust on the thirsty town. She could feel the stares of Judge Watts and Sheriff Delaney on her, a mixture of pity and impatience. They had been over it a dozen times. "There are no other witnesses, Vivian," Judge Watts said, his voice a low rumble that did little to soothe. He was a man who hid behind law books, but she knew his salary was paid by the same forces that had put James in a cell. The two hands from the Iron Crown Ranch swear they saw him set the fire to the barn, Clayton Voss's barn. "The two hands on Clayton Voss's payroll," she corrected, her voice quiet but clear. She did not turn around. To face them was to accept the helplessness in their eyes. "James was home with me. He was reading. You know my brother, Sheriff. He can barely light a lamp without burning his own fingers." Sheriff Delaney sighed, a sound of worn leather and resignation. "Your word against two others, Miss Marshall, and with the bad blood between your father, God rest his soul, and Mr. Voss, it doesn't look good. It looks like retribution." Bad blood was a polite way of putting it. Her father had called Clayton Voss a land thief and a water hog to his face, a man who bought justice like he bought cattle. A year after her father's funeral, Voss's barn burns down and her brother, who inherited his father's temper but not his caution, is found nearby, having had too much whiskey after a fight in the saloon. It was a perfect story, neat and tidy and utterly false. "So that's it." Vivian finally turned, her hands clasped tight in front of her gray cotton dress. At 23, she had a composure that unnerved men twice her age. Her intelligence was a sharp, clear thing, and right now it was telling her that logic had no place in this room. "We let them hang an innocent boy because Clayton Voss owns the only silver mine, half the cattle, and all the politicians in this territory." The door opened without a knock, and the devil himself walked in. Clayton Voss was a man built of solid, prosperous flesh. His suit was dark wool, absurd in the desert heat, but he wore it like armor. His face was clean-shaven, his silver hair neatly combed. He smiled, a practiced, confident expression that never reached his pale blue eyes. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of false respect. "Vivian, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as poured cream. "Judge, Sheriff, I hope I'm not interrupting." Sheriff Delaney shifted on his feet, suddenly fascinated by a crack in the floorboards. Judge Watts cleared his throat. "Clayton, we were just discussing the unfortunate matter of the Marshall boy." "A tragedy," Voss said, his eyes settling on Vivian. "A terrible waste of a young life. Which is why I've come with a proposition. A way to put all this unpleasantness behind us." Vivian stood her ground. "I am not selling our ranch, Mr. Voss." Voss chuckled, a sound like coins rubbing together. "Of course not. Land is sacred. No, this is more of a political solution, an alliance, a binding of interests to ensure the future peace and prosperity of Copper Ridge." He paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the moment. "I propose a marriage." The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. For a heartbeat, the only sound was a fly buzzing against the hot window pane. Vivian stared at him, certain she had misheard. A marriage. "Between you," Voss said, his smile widening, "and my ward, Thaddeus Mercer." The name fell into the room like a stone. Thaddeus Mercer. They called him Machu, the Apache word for wolf. He was Voss's shadow, his enforcer, the silent, scarred warrior who lived on the edge of the Iron Crown Ranch and was spoken of only in whispers. No one crossed him. No one even met his eyes. He was a ghost story told to frighten children. Except he was real. "You cannot be serious," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I am perfectly serious," Voss replied, his tone hardening. "You become his wife. I speak to the judge. My witnesses recant their testimony due to a confusion of the facts in the dark. James is released. The Marshall Ranch and the Iron Crown Ranch are joined by family. Hostilities cease. Order is restored." It was obscene. It was a trade. Her life for her brothers. She was to be a treaty, a piece of property exchanged to settle a feud Voss himself had manufactured. She looked at the judge, at the sheriff. Their faces were impassive, blank slates. They were not her allies. They were part of the mechanism. "This man," Vivian began, her mind racing, trying to find the words. "He is an Apache. He's your hired muscle." "He is a man of considerable skill," Voss corrected smoothly, "and a citizen of a sort. The government school in Carlisle saw to that, taught him English, taught him sums, taught him the Lord's Prayer, tried to teach him his place. They failed at that last part, but I succeeded." Voss walked over to the judge's desk and picked up a thin folder. He opened it and slid it across the polished wood toward her. "His file, for your consideration." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. The paper was dry and brittle. Inside, the typed words were cold and stark. Thaddeus Mercer, born of the White Mountain Apache, orphaned at 14 during the Gila River incident. A military action that was more of a massacre. His younger sister, Nalin, was among the dead. He was one of a handful of children taken, sent east to be civilized. The school reports noted his intelligence but called him intractably silent and prone to melancholic brooding. He ran away twice. The third time, they sent him back west to a reservation where Clayton Voss, in his capacity as a federal contractor, took an interest in the boy's tracking skills. The file detailed his work for Voss tracking rustlers, finding water sources, and serving as a scout. There was a clipped newspaper article about a payroll robbery where Mercer had tracked the outlaws for 3 days across the Sonoran Desert and brought them back. The article called him Voss's tamed wolf. A loyal and fearsome tool. There was no mention of a trial for the outlaws. The implication was clear. Thaddeus Mercer was judge, jury, and executioner when Voss willed it. He was a weapon, honed by tragedy and wielded by a tyrant. "Why?" Vivian asked, looking up from the file, her heart a cold knot in her chest. "Why this? Why him?" "Because it binds you not just to me, but to the very thing your sort fears and despises," Voss said, the pretense of civility dropping away to reveal the raw steel of his ambition. "It makes a statement. No one will question the finality of our arrangement, and it gives Mercer a respectable place in this community, a wife, a home. It completes his domestication." Voss smiled. "I am a benevolent man." Vivian. Benevolent. The word was a profanity. He was not giving Mercer a home. He was giving him a jailer. He was not giving Vivian a husband. He was giving her a leash held firmly in his own hand. She felt a surge of nausea. She thought of James, his hopeful, terrified face behind the bars of his cell. She thought of her father's dying wish, whispered with a ragged breath. "Don't let him take the land. Vivi, don't let him win." She was trapped between two impossible promises. Justice was a mirage in the desert. There was only power, and the choices it left you. She could refuse, and James would hang. Her family's name would be mud, and Voss would find another way to bleed her ranch dry, to take the water and the land until nothing was left. Or she could accept. She could walk into the cage, chain herself to a man spoken of as a beast, and in doing so, buy her brother's life and a sliver of time for her home. It was a choice that was not a choice at all, but if she had to walk into the cage, she would not do it blind. Vivian closed the file and pushed it back across the desk. She lifted her chin, meeting Voss's cold gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The terror was still there, churning in her stomach, but on the surface she was calm. She was her father's daughter. 3 days, she said. Voss raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. You will tell the circuit judge to delay his final ruling for 3 days, she stated, her voice even. I want to see the Iron Crown Ranch, and I want to meet Mr. Mercer. I will not be bound to a ghost story. I will see the man for myself. It was a gamble, a push against the crushing force of his will. For a moment, she saw a flicker of annoyance in Voss's eyes, the irritation of a king whose decree was being questioned by a commoner, but it was replaced by a slow, calculating smile. He found her defiance amusing, a small, final struggle before the inevitable. An entirely reasonable request, he said, inclining his head. A bride should see her future home and meet her groom. 3 days it is, Miss Marshall. But be assured, the outcome will be the same. He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving the scent of bay rum and absolute power in his wake. Judge Watts and Sheriff Delaney studiously avoided her eyes. The contract had been offered and provisionally accepted. Vivian walked out of the office and back into the searing afternoon light. The blacksmith's hammer started up again, each strike a blow against her heart. She had been given a choice that was a prison sentence, and she had chosen to walk toward the cell door to inspect the lock. She had 3 days, to look into the eyes of the silent warrior they called the Wolf, the man whose buried secrets were about to become her own. 3 days to find a weapon, any weapon, in the heart of her enemy's stronghold. The buckboard ride to the Iron Crown Ranch was long and silent. Save for the creak of the wheels and the snap of the driver's reins, Vivian sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar landscape of home twist into something alien and hostile. The ranch was not a ranch. It was a kingdom. Voss's main house stood on a rise, a 2-story monument of painted wood and glass windows that glittered like diamonds in the unrelenting sun. It was an arrogant building, meant to dominate the horizon. A woman with a kind, weary face and silver-threaded black hair met her at the porch. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, and she had been Clayton Voss's housekeeper for 20 years. She moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested she was the true master of the house, the one who knew where all the secrets were kept. Mr. Voss is occupied with the silver shipment, Maria said, her English soft with the music of her native tongue. He asked me to show you the grounds, and to introduce you to Mr. Mercer. Vivian's heart gave a small, hard thump. Where is he? Where he always is, Maria said, gesturing toward a large corral set a good distance from the main house, with the horses. The air by the corral was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and warm horsehide inside the circular fence. A man and a horse moved as one. The horse was a magnificent creature, a stallion as white as sun-bleached bone, with a wild eye and muscles that coiled and bunched like a series of powerful springs. The man was of average height, but moved with a low, centered grace that made him seem larger. He wore simple dungarees and a collarless shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and tanned to the color of dark leather. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing into the line of his jaw. It was an old wound, silvered with time. This was Thaddeus Mercer. He was not using a rope or a whip. He was using stillness. He would stand, unmoving, as the white stallion, which Vivian would later learn was called Ghost, circled him. Then he would take a single, deliberate step, and the horse would react, flaring its nostrils, tossing its head. Mercer would wait, his patience a tangible force in the hot, still air. It was a conversation without words, a slow dance of trust and tension. Vivian watched for a full 10 minutes, mesmerized by the silent communication passing between them. He seemed more a part of the natural world than the world of men, as elemental as the red earth under his worn boots. Finally, she walked to the fence. The crunch of her shoes on the gravel made the horse shy away, but Mercer did not startle. He simply turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark, and what she had expected to be hard or cruel was instead empty. It was a profound, deep emptiness, like a well with no bottom. He held no judgment in his gaze, no curiosity, only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. "Mr. Mercer," Vivian said, her voice sounding thin, "I am Vivian Marshall." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He did not speak. The stories were true. "Mr. Voss sent me. He explained the arrangement. The words tasted like poison." Mercer's gaze did not waver. He turned his attention back to the horse, taking another slow step toward it. Ghost trembled but held its ground. It was an exercise in pure will. "Can you speak?" she asked, a touch of frustration sharpening her tone. "Or are the stories true? Are you just his silent shadow?" He stopped. For a long moment, he was completely still. Then he walked to a small water trough where a piece of slate and a nub of chalk rested on a crate. He picked them up, his movements fluid and economical. He wrote 4 words, his letters precise and clear. He held the slate up for her to see. "Animals don't lie." Vivian stared at the words. It was not an answer, but a statement of principle, a declaration. It was also the most profound accusation she had ever read. In that simple sentence, he had indicted the whole world of men and their bargains, their courtrooms, their false testimonies, and their coercive propositions. He was placing himself on the side of the horse, on the side of instinct and truth, and leaving her standing with the liars. She felt a flush of shame, followed by a spark of something else. Not fear, intrigue. Maria led her away from the corral toward a small, solitary adobe dwelling that sat under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, well away from the main house and the bunkhouse. "This is his place," Maria said softly. "Mr. Voss thought you should see it." The inside was cool and dark after the glare of the sun. It was a single room, impeccably clean and sparsely furnished. A simple cot was covered with a wool blanket. A small table held a wash basin and a pitcher. But it was the other objects that held her attention. On a small, hand-carved shelf sat a half-dozen books. She stepped closer. It was not the Bible or cheap dime novels. It was Shakespeare's tragedies, a book of poetry by a man named Keats, and a heavy volume on Greek philosophy. Next to the books lay a wooden flute, worn smooth from handling. On the table, beside a kerosene lamp, was a thick leather-bound journal and an inkwell. And hanging from a peg on the wall was a small, beaded leather pouch, adorned with a single hawk feather, a medicine pouch. It was a piece of the world he had been forced to leave behind. Vivian stood in the center of the small room, turning slowly, taking it all in. This was not the home of a savage, a tamed wolf, or a mindless brute. This was the sanctuary of a scholar, a musician, a survivor. It was the home of a man living a dozen contradictions at once, a man who read Greek philosophy but kept an Apache medicine pouch, a man who could tame a wild horse with silence but lived under the thumb of a tyrant, a man who wrote on a slate that animals do not lie and kept a journal to hold the truths he could not speak. The deep emptiness in his eyes suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was not an absence of feeling, but a space that held too much. She was no longer just afraid of him. She was beginning to understand that he had every reason to be afraid of her, of what she represented. That evening, dinner was an ordeal. She sat opposite Clayton Voss at a long, polished mahogany table laden with heavy silver and delicate china. The food was rich, the wine was imported, and Voss was in an expansive mood. Mercer was not present. "Civilization is not a gift. My dear Vivian, it is a victory," Voss said, swirling the red wine in his crystal goblet. "It is won by strength, by vision, and sometimes by regrettable but necessary force. This land, this territory, is a wild beast, much like that stallion Mercer is taming. It must be broken. Its spirit must be bent to a productive purpose. The native, in his natural state, is much the same. He lives for the moment, without thought for the future, without a concept of progress or property." He took a sip of wine, his pale eyes fixed on her. "Look at Thaddeus. When I found him, He was little more than a wild animal himself, full of hate and fear. The school tried to beat it out of him, but they failed. They tried to fill him with scripture, but it did not take. I understood something they did not. You cannot erase a man's nature. You can only harness it. I gave him a purpose. I aimed his skills, his savagery, if you will, at my enemies. And in return, I gave him a place, a roof, a measure of safety he would never know on his own. I civilized him by making him useful. Vivian listened, her fork still on her plate. She heard the arrogance, the profound, unshakable belief in his own superiority. He was not just stealing land. He was stealing lives, histories, and reshaping them into tools for his own enrichment. He spoke of Mercer not as a man, but as a project, a successful experiment in subjugation. She saw the systematic process of it all, how he had taken a boy shattered by tragedy and reforged him into a weapon, all the while telling himself it was for the boy's own good. And now, he was doing the same to her, folding her into his grand design, another piece to be made useful. Later that night, unable to sleep in the stuffy, overly ornate guest room, Vivian walked out onto the long veranda. The desert air was cool, and the sky was a spray of brilliant, cold stars. Maria was there, sitting in a rocking chair, smoking a thin cheroot. "He is a good man," Maria said into the darkness, without preamble. She knew who Vivian was thinking about. "He works for a monster," Vivian replied, leaning against a porch column. "He works for the man who pulled him from a reservation jail when he was 16 years old," Maria corrected gently. "He was nearly dead from starvation and a beating he got for looking at a soldier the wrong way. Voss saw him, saw the fire in him, and took him. Is it loyalty, or is it the debt a survivor pays to the one who saved his life, even if the savior is a devil?" Maria took a long draw from her cheroot, the tip glowing red in the dark. "He does not talk about his past, but I have been here a long time. I know he lost everyone. They tried to make him a white man in a school back east, and it broke something inside him. Then they sent him back here, where the white men saw him as a savage and his own people saw him as a traitor. He belongs nowhere. So he made a place of his own, in the silence." "And you," Vivian asked. "You see what Voss is. Why do you stay?" Maria looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the desert. "This house has been my home for 20 years, and sometimes you find you can do more good fighting a fire from inside the house than by shouting at it from the outside." She stood up, her rocking chair creaking in protest. "Voss thinks he owns Mercer's loyalty. He owns his debt. He owns his silence, but he does not own his soul. No one does." She went inside, leaving Vivian alone with the stars and the quiet hum of the desert night. The image of Mercer in the corral, his patient, silent conversation with the white stallion returned to her. She thought of the books and the flute in his small, clean room. She thought of the 4 words on the slate. Her fear had begun its slow transformation into a complex and dangerous curiosity. The man she was being forced to marry was not the beast of the stories. He was a prisoner in a cage of his own making, a cage built of silence and debt and a past too terrible to speak of. And in 3 days, she was supposed to willingly walk in and lock the door behind her. The second day dawned with a hot wind that tasted of grit and distance. It was the kind of wind that frayed nerves and promised no relief. Vivian did not wait to be summoned. After a breakfast she barely touched, she walked directly to the adobe hut under the cottonwood. Thaddeus Mercer was outside, checking the leather straps on a saddle. He looked up as she approached, his face as unreadable as a stone tablet, but he did not turn away. "I want you to show me something," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Show me what you do. Show me what makes you so valuable to him." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for the trap in her words. Finding none, or perhaps deciding to spring it if there was one, he gave a single nod. He slung a canteen over his shoulder, picked up a rifle, and gestured with his head for her to follow. They walked away from the bustling hub of the ranch, heading out into the shimmering heat of the open desert. For the first hour, he did not speak. He simply walked, his stride economical and silent. Vivian, who had lived her entire life on the edge of this landscape, found herself struggling to keep pace without making a sound. Her boots crunched, twigs snapped under her feet. His seemed to find only soft earth and silent stone. He was not walking on the land. He was a part of its grammar. He stopped abruptly, pointing to the ground. She saw nothing but a patch of dry, cracked earth and a few hardy shrubs. He crouched, touching the edge of a barely perceptible disturbance in the soil. "Coyote," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, low and gravelly. 2 hours passed, dragging a rabbit. She looked closer, and now she could see it, the faint drag marks, the slight depression where a heavier body had passed. He moved on, pointing to a bent branch on a creosote bush. Deer. A doe. Yesterday. He showed her how to tell the direction of the wind not just by the feel on her cheek, but by the lean of the grasses, the drift of the finest dust particles. He led her to a place that looked utterly barren and, using the butt of his rifle, dug 2 feet down to uncover the damp, cool sand that indicated a seep of underground water. He was teaching her his language, the language of the earth. It was a vocabulary of subtle signs and silent messages, a narrative written in broken twigs and displaced pebbles. She realized with a growing sense of awe that his silence was not an absence of communication. It was a different, more profound form of it. He listened to the world with an intensity she had never imagined. Here, away from Voss's arrogant house and the suffocating weight of her predicament, he was not a weapon or a tool. He was a scholar of the natural world, a reader of its oldest and most honest texts. They rested in the shade of a rock outcropping, sharing water from his canteen. The sun was a hammer overhead. "Why did you stop speaking?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. The scar on his cheek seemed to tighten. He did not answer. The silence that returned was different from before. It was not empty. It was a wall, and she had just run into it. When they returned to the ranch in the late afternoon, Vivian felt a shift inside her. The lines of her world, once so clearly drawn between friend and foe, good and bad, were blurring. That evening, driven by a need she could no longer ignore, she committed a trespass. While Mercer was in the corral with the white stallion and Maria was busy in the main house, Vivian slipped back into his adobe hut. The leather journal was on the table. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. It felt like a violation of the deepest sort, a betrayal of the quiet respect he had shown her in the desert. But James's face swam in her memory, and she opened the book. The handwriting was the same as on the slate, neat and spare. The entries were not dated with days of the week or months, but with seasons and moons. She found the part she was looking for, an entry written years ago, not long after he had been brought to the Iron Crown. The English was stark, the words chosen with a terrible precision. He wrote of his village, Gila River. He wrote of the surprise attack at dawn, the sound of the soldiers' bugles and the screams. He did not write of his own fear, only of what he saw. He described his sister, Nalin, who was 12. He wrote that she had been running, her black hair flying behind her, when a soldier on a horse, a lieutenant named Carver, had raised his pistol. The entry did not describe the aftermath. It simply stated he shot her in the back. Her name was Nalin. The next pages were the key. He wrote of his time at the government school in Carlisle. He described how they had taken his language and his clothes and his name, giving him Thaddeus in its place. He wrote about his words. When he tried to tell them what happened to Nalin, the schoolmasters called him a liar. When he spoke of his home, they called him a savage. When he argued, they beat him for insolence. His words, he wrote, were twisted into shapes he did not recognize. They were used as proof of his wildness, his ingratitude, his need for correction. They took my voice, so I took my words. The last line of the entry read, "Silence is the only story they cannot rewrite." Vivian closed the journal, her heart aching. His silence was not just a shield, it was a memorial. It was a vow of integrity. a refusal to participate in a world that had made his truth a lie. He had buried his past, not to forget it, but to protect it from further desecration. She left the hut, feeling like a grave robber, but with a piece of the puzzle she desperately needed. This man was not Voss's creature. He was his own, in the only way he knew how to be. That night, the hot wind rattled the window panes of the main house. Vivian was pacing in her room when she heard voices from the study below. The window was open to catch any breeze. She crept to her own window and leaned out, listening. It was Voss, and another man, his ranch foreman. "She is proving more observant than I anticipated," Voss said, his voice laced with annoyance. "But it does not matter. The wedding will proceed. Once she is Mercer's wife, her name is his. Her land is tied to him, and he is tied to me." "And the brother the foreman asked?" "He will be released. Of course. We must maintain the appearance of the bargain," Voss said with a dismissive chuckle. "Let him return to the ranch. Let them have a few months of peace. A year, perhaps. Then there will be an accident. A fall from a horse, a rattlesnake bite, a drunken dispute in town. James Marshall is known for his temper. No one will be surprised. With him gone, the sister will be alone, married to my man. The Marshall ranch will be absorbed into the Iron Crown without another shot fired. It is a cleaner, more permanent solution." Vivian pulled back from the window, a cold dread washing over her. It was worse than she had imagined. The marriage was not the cage, it was merely the bait. The true trap would be sprung later. When she and James felt safe, Voss would not stop until he had everything, and he would eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Her brother's life was not being saved, it was only being postponed. She knew what she had to do. There was only one path, a terrifying, narrow trail through the heart of the enemy's country. She did not wait for morning. She pulled on her boots, slipped out of the house, and ran toward the solitary light burning in the window of the adobe hut. Mercer was sitting at his table, cleaning his rifle. When she burst in, he was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands, his body coiled and ready. "Put it down," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I am not the enemy." He lowered the rifle slowly, his eyes questioning. "I know what Voss is planning," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The wedding is a lie. He is going to have my brother killed after he is released. He told his foreman. I heard him." Mercer's expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He already knew. She realized. He knew Voss's capacity for cruelty better than anyone. "I read your journal," she confessed, the words rushing out. "I know about your sister. I know why you are silent. Voss thinks he owns your silence, but he does not. He thinks this marriage will be his final victory, a way to chain both of us. He is wrong." She stepped closer, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "He is forcing a bond between us. He intends for it to be a chain. I say we forge it into a sword. You and me. This wedding, this alliance, we accept it. We go into it with our eyes open, and from the inside, we tear him down. You know his business. You know his secrets. I have a printing press my father left me. We find his crimes, and we tell the world. We become the story they cannot rewrite." It was a declaration of war. She stood before him, offering not a plea but a pact, an alliance of the dispossessed, a conspiracy of the silenced. He stared at her, the lamplight carving deep shadows on his face. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between a lifetime of hard-won survival through solitude and this sudden, insane proposal of trust. To join her was to betray the only man who had offered him a form of protection, twisted though it was. It was to step out of the silence that had been his only sanctuary. It was to risk everything. She held his gaze, willing him to see the truth in her offer. It was not about salvation or romance. It was about justice, a concept he had likely abandoned long ago. He walked to the wall and took down the small, beaded medicine pouch. He held it in his hand for a long moment. Then he looked at her. and the emptiness in his eyes was filled with a flicker of something she had not seen before. It was the faintest ember of a long-buried fire. "He has ledgers," Mercer said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear. "In his office, hidden. They detail everything." It was the most he had ever said to her. It was a key. It was an answer. It was yes. The church was small, the air inside thick and still, tasting of dry wood and old hymns. Sunlight streamed through the tall, plain-glass windows, not as a blessing but as an accusation, illuminating every mote of dust dancing in the heavy air. The pews were divided as if by an invisible, uncrossable river. On the right sat Clayton Voss, his foreman, and a handful of his business associates from town, their faces smug and proprietary. On the left, the pews were empty. The people of Copper Ridge, who had known Vivian Marshall her entire life, had chosen to stay away. They whispered about the wedding in the street and in the saloon, a scandal, a surrender, a tragedy, but they would not bear witness. Her brother, James, was notably absent, a guest at the county jail until this unholy contract was signed. Vivian stood at the front, beside a wilting pot of geraniums. She wore her mother's plainest Sunday dress, a dark blue poplin that felt both comforting and funereal. She was not a bride. She was a ransom. Each breath she took was a conscious act of defiance against the terror that threatened to buckle her knees. She felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. Then the side door opened and Thaddeus Mercer walked in. He did not walk to the front like a groom, but moved along the wall with the silent, fluid grace she had seen in the desert, as if seeking the shadows. He wore a dark, ill-fitting suit that looked as foreign on him as a saddle on a wolf. It was clean, it was formal, but it was a costume. His dark hair was slicked back with water, and the scar on his cheek was a pale, stark line against his sun-darkened skin. He came to stand beside her, a good foot of space between them, and faced the preacher. He did not look at her. He smelled of soap and the outdoors, a clean, wild scent that was entirely out of place in the stale church air. The preacher, a nervous man with a perpetually damp forehead, rushed through the words as if he feared they might catch fire on his tongue. He spoke of holy matrimony, of union and devotion, his voice hollow and insincere. When he turned to Mercer, the man was silent for a long moment. The entire church held its breath. Vivian could feel Voss's impatience like a physical force. Then, Mercer's lips moved, and a sound came out, soft as a sigh, a string of guttural, musical syllables. It was the Apache language, a prayer or a promise spoken to ghosts only he could see. Having paid his respects to his own world, he turned his head slightly and looked at the preacher. "I do," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the silent church. The preacher turned to her, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Do you, Vivian Marshall, take this man?" She did not hear the rest. She saw James's face, pale and desperate behind bars. She saw her father's ranch, the dry earth and the struggling cattle, the only home she had ever known. She saw the cold calculation in Clayton Voss's eyes. This was not a vow. It was a move in a war. "I do," she said, her voice clear and steady. After the signing of the register, while Voss accepted the false congratulations of his men outside, Vivian slipped away. She found a small, unused room off the chancel, a place for storing hymnals and broken chairs. A tall, narrow mirror with a crack running through the silvering hung on one wall. She stood before it and looked at her reflection. A stranger looked back, a woman in a borrowed dress with eyes that held no joy, only a grim, cold fire. The whispers of the town, the smug look on Voss's face, the quiet, immense weight of the man she had just bound herself to it all, coalesced into a single, sharp thought, a caption for this terrible, still moment of her life. They bound her to the warrior no man dared to cross until she found the secret he buried in silence. The secret was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a history to be honored. It was the source of a strength forged in unimaginable loss. His silence was not emptiness, but a shield for his soul, a place where he kept his humanity safe from a world that had tried to strip it from him. And now, in this forced alliance, he had allowed her to step behind that shield. They rode back to the Marshall Ranch in a buckboard Mercer had waiting. He handled the reins with an easy competence, his hands firm and quiet on the leather. The silence between them was no longer awkward or menacing. It was a shared space, a territory they were both beginning to navigate. When her family's small, sturdy ranch house came into view, a wave of relief washed over Vivian. This was her ground. But Mercer did not stop at the house. He guided the horses toward the blackened, skeletal ruins of the barn. He tied off the reins and got down, his eyes scanning the debris with the same focused intensity he had shown in the desert. Vivian followed him. "The sheriff said it was a lantern," she said quietly, "that James dropped it in the hay." Mercer shook his head without looking at her. He walked to the edge of the foundation, where a few charred timbers remained. He knelt, running his fingers over the blackened wood, sniffing them. He scraped at the dirt beneath with the tip of his knife. Then he moved to another spot, on the opposite side of the ruins, and did the same. "No," he said, his voice low. He stood and looked at her. Fire was set in 2 places, here and there. He pointed. "Used coal oil. Burns hot and fast. The scorch marks go down, not up." It was meant to look like an accident, but it was done by someone who wanted to be sure the whole thing went up before anyone could stop it. It was confirmation of what she had always known in her heart, but hearing it stated as a simple, physical fact sent a chill through her. This was not just a lie told to frame her brother. It was a calculated act of destruction, an attack on her home, her livelihood. It was Voss's signature, written in ash and smoke. "We need proof," she said, her voice thick with a new, harder anger, something more than tracks in the dirt. "We need his words, his numbers." "The ledgers," Mercer said. He was looking toward the small outbuilding that her father had used as an office, and later, as a place to store the tool that had been his first trade and his greatest passion, his printing press. The office was dusty and smelled of old paper and rust. The centerpiece of the room was the heavy iron printing press, a hulking black machine that had sat dormant for years. Her father had been a rancher, but he had the soul of a journalist. He believed that truth, set in lead and pressed onto paper, was the most powerful force in the world. He always said this was the only weapon that truly frightened men like Voss, Vivian said, running her hand over the cold, flat plate of the press. The power to tell a story to everyone. Mercer was not listening to her words. His eyes were scanning the machine, not as a tool for communication, but as a physical object. He ran his hands along the heavy, ornate cast-iron frame, his touch light and searching. He tapped a section near the base. The resulting sound was not the dull thud of solid iron. It was a slightly higher, hollower note. He looked at her, and she saw a question in his eyes. She nodded. Together, they found the seam, a hairline crack disguised as part of the decorative casting. Using Mercer's knife and a heavy wrench from her father's tool bench, they pried at it. The iron groaned in protest. Then a heavy plate, cleverly fitted and painted to match the rest of the frame, came loose. Inside was a small, dark cavity, and nestled within it was a flat, heavy iron box, secured with a sturdy lock. There was no key. Mercer did not hesitate. He took the wrench and, with a few short, powerful blows, shattered the lock mechanism. He lifted the heavy lid. Vivian leaned over, her heart pounding against her ribs. The box was filled with papers, all neatly bundled. On top was a stack of ledgers, bound in black leather. She opened the first one. It was a meticulous record of bribes, illegal land purchases, and payments to hired men for services described in coded but unmistakable terms. It was Clayton Voss's secret history, his monument to greed and corruption. Beneath the ledgers were letters, correspondence with federal agents and military officers, outlining plans to pressure reservation tribes and open up their land for mining exploration. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of glass plate photographs. The first few were of miners and railroad surveyors. but the last one made Vivian gasp. It was a photograph of a young Clayton Voss, looking confident and prosperous, his arms slung around the shoulders of a uniformed cavalry officer. The officer was smiling proudly. It was the face from Mercer's journal, the face of Lieutenant Carver. Mercer took the photograph from her shaking hands. He stared at it, his face a mask of stone, but she could feel the tremor that ran through him. He turned it over. On the back, in elegant faded ink, a caption was written, "Gila River Expedition, 1871, a successful and profitable venture." Profitable. He had called a massacre a profitable venture. This box was not just evidence of Voss's crimes against her family. It was the story of the crime that had unmade Mercer's world. Her father, she realized, must have been collecting this evidence for years, hiding it in the heart of his truth-telling machine. Vivian and Mercer stood in the dusty silence of the old office. The terrible, damning secrets of Clayton Voss spread out between them. The forced wedding, the false charges, the burned barn, it was all part of a single, sprawling story of violence and greed. And now, in their hands, they held the weapon her father had left behind. They had the truth, set not in lead, but in ink and images, and they were going to print it for the whole world to see. The nights became their sanctuary. The small office, a bubble of lamplight in the vast, dark desert. The only sounds were the scratching of Vivian's pen, the soft rustle of paper, and the chirping of crickets outside the window. They worked with a shared, unspoken intensity. With the iron box open on the floor between them, they began the painstaking task of creating a second set of the evidence. Vivian's hand, accustomed to writing letters and keeping ranch accounts, moved swiftly across the pages, her script clear and precise. She copied every line from Voss's ledgers, every damning number, every coded entry. Mercer sat opposite her. The original documents spread before him. He did not write. He watched. He pointed. He interpreted. His knowledge of Voss's operations was encyclopedic. "This name," he would say, his voice a low murmur, tapping a finger on a line. "He is a federal land surveyor. The payment is for a false report on water rights, or renegade pacification. That means he hired men to burn out settlers who would not sell to him." He was a living key, unlocking the full meaning of the crimes her father had documented. They were not just a team, they were two halves of a single mind. She had the language of the written word, the skill to create the record. He had the language of the land and of Voss's dark dealings, the knowledge to give the record its terrible voice. In those long, lamp-lit hours, a new kind of intimacy grew between them, forged in ink and secrets and shared purpose. They decided the copies must go to Captain Bennett of the United States Army at Fort Apache, a man known for his rigid adherence to the law and his open disdain for civilian contractors like Voss. The days were different. The work of the ranch could not wait. They moved in a careful choreography of shared labor. Mercer, with his profound understanding of animals, helped her mend fences and tend to the small herd. He moved with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and deeply impressive. He taught her how to predict the weather by the clouds gathering over the Dragoon Mountains, how to patch a leather harness so it would hold for another season. One afternoon he found her father's old rifle. He watched her check it, his eyes missing nothing. "You know how to use it?" he asked. "My father taught me," she said, "but I am not a good shot." "You will be," he said. It was not a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. He took her out to a dry wash behind the house and set up old tins on a rock. His instruction was sparse, physical. He did not lecture. He adjusted her stance with a light touch on her shoulder. He showed her how to control her breathing, how to let it out slow and steady before squeezing the trigger, not pulling it. He stood behind her, so close she could feel the heat of his body, his voice a low rumble by her ear. "Do not fight the gun. Let it become a part of you. See the target, and the bullet is already there." She fired. The tin can flew off the rock. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. When she turned to look at him, the corner of his mouth was turned up in the barest hint of a smile himself. It was a small thing, a fleeting expression, but it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. In that moment, the wall of his silence, the shield of his past, seemed to develop a hairline crack. Later that week, while they were working late into the night on the last of the letters, exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her head grew heavy, her pen strokes faltering. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on the cool wood of the desk for just a moment. When she drifted back to awareness, she realized her head had slipped, and she was resting against Mercer's shoulder. He had not moved. He sat as still as a statue, a warm, solid presence beside her. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. She did not pull away. For the first time since James's arrest, she felt a profound, bone-deep sense of safety. She was not alone in this fight. When the last word was copied, the last photograph catalogued, they put the originals back in the iron box and returned it to its hiding place within the printing press. The copies were wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a different spot, in a loose stone of the root cellar. Their work was done. A heavy silence fell, the absence of their shared task leaving a vacuum. They walked out onto the porch, into the cool, clean air of the desert night. A sliver of moon hung in a sky littered with stars. Vivian wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden shiver running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The weight of what they had done, and what was yet to come, settled on her. Mercer saw the tremor. He stepped closer. She thought he might say something, offer a word of reassurance. Instead, he simply opened his arms. It was an invitation, not a demand. She did not hesitate. She stepped into his embrace, pressing her face against the rough cotton of his shirt. His arms came around her, holding her with a strength that was gentle, protective. He was solid and real, smelling of horse and pine and the dry desert earth. He held her as she trembled, his hand stroking her hair in a slow, calming rhythm. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound human comfort, a quiet acknowledgement of the storm they faced together. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, and she heard him whisper something, a soft, flowing sound in his own language. The words were a mystery to her, but the tone was one of deep and solemn reverence. She tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes searching his in the pale moonlight. The emptiness was gone. In its place was a warmth, a light that seemed to come from a great and guarded depth. "What did you say?" she whispered. His thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek. "She-K," he said, his voice husky. "It means the one who walks beside me." Before she could answer, before she could fully absorb the meaning of the gift he had just given her, a new sound intruded on the night, the rhythmic drumming of a horse's hooves, coming fast. A rider emerged from the darkness, pulling his lathered horse to a stop in the yard. It was one of Voss's men from the Iron Crown. "Mercer," the man yelled, his voice sharp with urgency. "Voss wants you, now. There's a band of renegade Apaches spotted up near the Chiricahua Pass. He wants you to lead the tracking party. You are to leave immediately." The world snapped back into its harsh, unforgiving focus. The warmth of the embrace vanished, replaced by an icy dread. It was a command, an order from the man who still believed he owned him. It was a test and a trap. Mercer's face became a mask again. The light in his eyes extinguished, replaced by the old, familiar watchfulness. He knew, as she did, that this was no random raid. It was a move on Voss's chessboard, and Mercer was the piece being sent into danger. He gave a curt nod to the rider. "Tell him I am coming." The man wheeled his horse and galloped back into the night. A tense, terrible silence fell between them. He had to go. To refuse would be to show his hand, to declare his rebellion before they were ready. "Do not go," she pleaded, her voice a whisper. "I must," he said. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw the reality of his position. He was still a prisoner of his debt, of the life Voss had both saved and stolen. He turned to go saddle his horse. Panic seized her. She could not let him leave like this, with the new, fragile connection between them hanging by a thread. She fumbled at the collar of her dress, her fingers finding the small, silver locket she always wore. It had been her mother's. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of her parents on their wedding day. It was her most precious possession. She unclasped the chain and ran to him, catching his arm. "Take this," she said, pressing the locket into his hand. His fingers closed around the warm metal. "So you will remember the way back." He looked down at the small, intricate piece of silver in his palm, then back at her face. It was not a request. It was a promise she was demanding from him. A vow to survive. He closed his hand, the locket a small, hard shape against his skin. He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I will come back," he said. It was not a boast or a hope. It was a solemn oath. Then he was gone, moving with his silent, swift grace into the darkness toward the corral. Vivian stood alone on the porch, her hand at her throat where the locket used to be, listening until the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the vast, waiting silence of the desert. The quiet promise of the night had been shattered, replaced by the loud, clear toll of a coming storm. The 2 days after Mercer's departure were the longest of Vivian's life. A heavy, unnatural quiet settled over the ranch, a silence that felt like a held breath. The wind picked up as the second night bled toward morning, a restless, sighing presence that skittered across the dry yard and moaned under the eaves of the house. Vivian could not sleep. She sat in a chair by the window, her father's rifle across her lap, watching the landscape dissolve into shades of gray and black. The promise of the locket felt 1,000 miles away. A movement in the darkness, so swift and silent it was more a feeling than a sight, made her heart leap into her throat. She raised the rifle. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the corral, moving with a fluid, earth-hugging grace that was achingly familiar. It was not Mercer. It was a young Apache man, dressed in buckskins, his face lean and intense. He raised a hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. Vivian went to the door, opening it just a crack. "Who are you?" "I am Swiftfoot," the man said, his voice low and urgent. "I am a friend to Machu. He sent me." She opened the door wider. "What is it? Where is he?" "He tracks the men who wear the paint of our people but are not our people," Swiftfoot said, his words precise. "He sent me ahead. To warn you, they are not a raiding party. They are a war party. They do not ride for horses or supplies. They ride to burn this place to the ground, to make it look like the work of renegades. So the soldiers will have an excuse to push our people from the mountains and a rich white man can claim the land." He did not have to say the name. Voss. The wind howled, as if in confirmation. The trap was not for Mercer in the mountains. It was for her. Here, the raid was the pretext, the final, bloody act to seize her home. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the ice in her veins. "They will come before the sun," Swiftfoot said, "to use the last of the darkness for their attack." There was no time for fear. There was only time for work. She woke the 2 loyal vaqueros who had stayed on after her father's death, old men with faces like wrinkled leather who had known her since she was a child. As they began to barricade the windows, a wagon rattled into the yard. Vivian raised her rifle again, then lowered it in disbelief. Maria Gonzalez sat on the driver's bench, her face set and determined. In the back of the wagon were 3 men, former hands from the Iron Crown, their expressions a mixture of fear and resolve, and sitting beside Maria, looking pale but resolute, was her brother, James. "The sheriff let me go this morning," James said as he jumped down, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "He said the charges were being reconsidered. Maria was waiting for me." "What is happening, Vivi?" "We are about to be attacked," Vivian said simply. Maria climbed down from the wagon, her movements stiff but purposeful. "I heard the whispers at the ranch," Maria said, her dark eyes flashing. "I heard Voss giving his foreman orders for a punitive action. I told these men what was happening, that they were being asked to help murder a woman and her brother for a piece of land. She looked at the three men, who shuffled their feet in the dirt. Their courage is a new and fragile thing, but they are here. She then looked at Vivian, her expression softening. I told you once that sometimes you fight a fire from inside the house. I was wrong. You cannot. Not when the arsonist is the one who owns it. There was no time for gratitude. The eastern sky was beginning to pale from black to a deep, bruised purple. Swiftfoot, who had disappeared, returned with a report. They are coming, 12 riders. Inside, everyone, Vivian commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. Juan, you and Miguel take the front windows. James, you are with me in the main room. Maria, you and the others are in charge of the water. They worked in a frantic, silent ballet. Every bucket, basin, and pot was filled with water from the well and placed strategically around the house. The men from the Iron Crown, their faces grim, checked their rifles. The house, once a place of warmth and memory, became a fortress. The attack came with a terrifying suddenness. A chorus of high, ululating cries echoed from the darkness, a grotesque mockery of an Apache war cry. Then came the fire. Torches, arcing through the air like malevolent falling stars, thudded against the dry wooden walls of the house. The raiders did not charge. They circled, whooping and yelling, throwing more torches. Their strategy clear: burn them out or die in the flames. The world shrank to the confines of the small ranch house. The air grew thick with smoke, the crackle of flames a hungry, growing roar. Vivian fired, reloaded, fired again. She did not aim for the men, but for the torches in their hands, trying to extinguish the source. Beside her, James, his face streaked with soot, fired with a methodical fury. The boy who had been defined by his temper was now a man defined by a desperate, protective calm. The west wall is catching, one of the vaqueros yelled. Maria Vivian shouted, her throat raw. Maria and the men from the Iron Crown worked with a desperate efficiency, sloshing buckets of water onto the burning planks, the hiss of steam and the choking smoke filling the room. They were in a desperate race, the fire consuming the house from the outside while they fought it from within. A stray spark landed in Maria's hair, and James lunged, beating it out with his bare hands, his face a mask of concentration. The smell of scorched hair and burning pine filled the air. They were losing. For every flame they doused, 2 more seemed to spring to life. The attackers were growing bolder, riding closer, their shots splintering the barricaded windows. Vivian rammed another cartridge into her rifle, her shoulder aching, her eyes streaming from the smoke. She thought of the locket, of Mercer's promise. It felt like a lifetime ago. Then, through the chaos, she heard a new sound. Not the false cries of the attackers, but the clear, ringing call of a cavalry bugle. From the east, with the first hint of the rising sun at their backs, a line of blue-coated soldiers on horseback appeared, charging forward in perfect formation, and riding at their head, on a dark, powerful horse, was Thaddeus Mercer. He was no longer in the clumsy suit, but in his own buckskins, the rifle in his hands looking like a natural extension of his arm. From the west, Swiftfoot and a handful of Apache warriors emerged from the folds of the land, their movements silent and deadly. The attackers, caught in a classic pincer movement, fell into chaos. Their fake war cries died in their throats, replaced by shouts of panic. They were no longer hunters. They were the hunted. The soldiers, disciplined and relentless, bore down on them. The fight was short and brutal. Some of the attackers were cut down, but most, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, threw down their weapons and surrendered. As the smoke began to clear, Vivian stumbled out of the house, coughing, her face black with soot. Mercer was already off his horse, his eyes scanning the smoldering walls of her home. His face grim, his gaze found hers, and the relief that washed over her was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He had come back. An officer with a stern, mustached face rode up beside him. "Captain Harrison," he said, his voice a crisp baritone, "it seems your intelligence was correct." Mercer did not acknowledge the compliment. He walked to his saddlebag and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped package of copied documents. "This is the proof, Captain," he said, his voice low and clear. "The reason for this attack, the man who paid these men is Clayton Voss." Harrison took the package, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the captured attackers, who were now being rounded up, their fake war paint streaked with sweat and fear. He dismounted and walked over to one of them, a young man with terror in his eyes. "Who sent you?" Harrison demanded, his voice like cracking ice. The young man stammered, looking at the bodies of his comrades lying in the dirt, at the grim faces of the soldiers surrounding him. His false bravado had evaporated, leaving only a raw, desperate fear. "It was Voss," he choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "Clayton Voss. He paid us. He paid us to dress up like savages and burn them out. He said no one would question an Apache raid." The confession hung in the air, a stark and ugly truth in the clean light of the new day. Vivian looked at Mercer. He was watching her, his dark eyes holding a universe of unspoken things. The siege was broken. The battle for the ranch had been won. But standing there, amidst the wreckage and the smoke, they both knew the war had just begun. The federal courtroom in Tucson was a world away from the dust and smoke of the ranch. It was a grand, cavernous space with high ceilings, dark, polished wood, and the suffocating air of manufactured importance. The room was packed. Journalists from as far as Phoenix scribbled furiously in their notepads, their presence lending a theatrical air to the proceedings. The trial of Clayton Voss was not just a local matter anymore. It was a spectacle, a referendum on the very soul of the Arizona Territory. Vivian sat in the front row, a still point in the swirling chaos of whispers and rustling paper. Beside her, Mercer was an island of profound calm. He wore a simple, clean shirt and dungarees, a stark contrast to the dark suits of the lawyers and politicians. He did not look at Voss. His attention was fixed on the judge, his posture communicating a quiet, unshakable readiness. The evidence, presented by a determined federal prosecutor, was overwhelming. The ledgers her father had so carefully hidden were laid bare, each entry a nail in Voss's coffin. The prosecutor read them aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room: payments to false witnesses, bribes to land officials, coded instructions for intimidation and violence. The letters followed, revealing the depth of Voss's conspiracy to dispossess the Apache tribes of their land. His correspondence with men like the infamous Lieutenant Carver painting a picture of cold, calculated greed. The glass plate photograph was presented to the jury, a silent, damning testament to the unholy alliance that had resulted in a massacre. Through it all, Clayton Voss sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief. He looked not like a man on trial, but like a king who had been temporarily inconvenienced by the insolence of his subjects. Then, Thaddeus Mercer was called to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as he walked forward. He moved with his usual economy of grace, taking the oath with a quiet solemnity. The prosecutor began his questions, and Mercer answered them in English, his voice low but clear, each word chosen with the same precision he used to read a track in the desert. He detailed his years of service to Voss, describing the orders he was given, the crimes he witnessed, the system of fear and control Voss had perfected. He was a factual, unimpeachable witness. "And can you tell the court," the prosecutor asked, his voice softening, "about the events at Gila River in 1871? Mercer was silent for a long moment. He turned his head and, for the first time, his eyes met Vivian's. She gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. He then looked at the jury, 12 ordinary men now tasked with weighing the history of a territory. He began to speak, but the words were not English. It was the language of his people, a soft, flowing cadence of sound that was both a lament and an accusation. The courtroom was utterly still, held captive by the raw, undeniable grief in his voice. He spoke for a full minute, his eyes closed, as if seeing the events unfold behind his eyelids. Then he stopped, took a slow breath, and opened his eyes. "I will now say it in the tongue of this court," he said, his voice resonating with a new power. "I was 14 years old when the soldiers came. They were led by Lieutenant Carver, a man who called my people vermin. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter of women and children and old men. My sister, Naylin, was 12. She was running. She was a child, and she was running for her life. Lieutenant Carver, the man in that photograph, the friend and business partner of Mr. Voss, shot her in the back. The Gila River expedition was not a military action. It was a land grab, paid for in blood, so that men like Mr. Voss could get rich from the minerals beneath our homes." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, stunned faces in the room. "I am not here for revenge," he said, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its intensity. "Revenge is a fire that burns the one who holds it. I am here for accountability. A man must answer for his actions. A society must answer for the injustices it allows. That is the law. Not just the white man's law, but the law of the earth and the sky and the human heart." He said nothing more. He did not need to. His testimony was a bridge, connecting the cold, hard facts of the ledgers to the profound human cost of Voss's ambition. He had taken back his voice, and with it, he had retold the story of his people, not as victims, but as the bearers of a truth that could no longer be silenced. The jury was out for less than an hour. The verdict was guilty, on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, incitement to violence, murder. The judge, his face grim, sentenced Clayton Voss to hang by the neck until he was dead. Voss finally broke, lunging to his feet, his face purple with rage, screaming about his rights, his contributions, his power, until the marshals dragged him, still shouting, from the courtroom. On the day of the execution, Vivian and Mercer were not in Tucson. They were at the ranch, rebuilding. The sun was hot on their backs as they worked together, setting a new post for the corral fence. The rhythmic thud of the sledgehammer was a sound of construction, of creation. They did not speak of what was happening in the city. They did not need to. Their choice to be here, to work the land, to build something new from the ashes of the old, was its own verdict. They were choosing life, not death. In the months that followed, the ripples of the trial spread. Vivian, using her father's meticulously maintained printing press, published the first edition of a small, 4-page newspaper. She called it The Territory Truth. It reported on the trial's aftermath, on the ongoing investigations into land fraud, and it gave a voice to the settlers and ranchers who had been bullied and marginalized by Voss's corrupt network. Mercer, now a respected figure whose testimony had been printed in newspapers across the territory, began a different kind of work. He met with Captain Harrison and other officials, using his unique position as a man who understood both worlds to advocate for better conditions on the reservations. He argued not for charity, but for fairness, for promised treaty goods to be delivered, for agents to be held accountable, for the right of his people to govern themselves. He was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming a leader. One day, Judge Watts, the same man who had presided over James's initial hearing, rode out to the ranch. He was a changed man, the weary resignation in his eyes replaced by a quiet fire. He spoke to Vivian not as a petitioner, but as a peer, asking her about the legal loopholes that allowed men like Voss to flourish, seeking her input for a series of reforms he hoped to propose. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. That autumn, Vivian realized she was pregnant. The quiet joy that filled the small ranch house was a testament to how far they had come. They had a daughter, born in the spring with a thatch of black hair and eyes that held the deep, calm wisdom of her father. They named her Nalin Catherine, Nalin, for the sister whose memory was now a legacy of truth, and Catherine, for Vivian's mother, a legacy of enduring love. A year to the day after the grim ceremony in the Copper Ridge Church, they were married again. There were 2 ceremonies. The first was held at dusk, in a quiet grove of cottonwoods by the creek. Swiftfoot and a small delegation of his people came. An elder spoke in the Apache language, his words weaving them into the fabric of the land, the sky, and the community. He blessed their union with smoke from a small fire and the scent of sacred herbs. The second ceremony was held on the porch of the ranch house. Judge Watts officiated, his voice filled with a genuine warmth. James stood as a witness, his face clear and happy, beside a beaming Maria. This time, when the judge asked the question, Vivian's "I do" was not an act of strategy, but a simple, profound statement of fact. And when Mercer said the words, his voice was steady and strong, a promise made not under duress, but in the clear, open air of a freedom they had made for themselves. The bond, once a chain, had been reforged by their own hands into a ring. A decade is a lifetime. It is long enough for a sapling to become a shade tree, for a wound to become a scar, and for a battlefield to become a home. The afternoon sun of 1891 fell on the Marshall Mercer Ranch with a soft, golden light, the kind of light that promised peace. The air, once thick with the taste of ash and fear, now carried the scent of baking bread, curing hay, and the faint, sweet perfume of desert primrose blooming along the creek bed. Where the blackened skeleton of the old barn had stood, a new, longer building now stood, built of sturdy pine and local adobe. But it was not a barn. From its open windows came a sound that was, in its own way, a greater miracle than a harvest. It was the sound of children's voices reciting their lessons. Some spoke in clear, crisp English, others spoke in the rolling, musical cadence of the Apache. Most of the children, as the years went on, could switch between the two with an easy, unthinking grace. This was the Copper Ridge Community School, a project born from a newspaper column Vivian had written and a council Mercer had held with Swiftfoot's people. It was a place where a child's mind was valued more than the color of their skin. A little farther down near the main road, a trading post had been built. It was managed by James, a man now in his late 20s, his youthful temper cooled by responsibility into a quiet, steady competence. Here, Apache women traded intricately woven baskets and pottery for flour and calico, their transactions governed not by exploitation, but by a mutually agreed-upon price list tacked to the wall. Vaqueros and miners and settlers did their business alongside them, the old lines of suspicion and hostility blurred by the simple, daily act of fair commerce. The ranch itself was a testament to shared labor. Mercer's knowledge of the land, of where to find water and how to read the seasons, had merged with the Marshall family's generations of ranching experience. The herd was larger and healthier than it had ever been. Men from the nearby reservation worked alongside the vaqueros, their skills and their wages identical. They had built more than a successful ranch. They had built a small, fragile, and functioning model of a different kind of world. From the porch of the main house, Vivian watched it all. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, now had threads of silver at the temples, earned from long nights setting type for the Territory Truth and longer nights nursing sick children. She was no longer just the woman who had defied Clayton Voss. She was a pillar of the community she had helped to shape. Her pen, a tool for building bridges as much as it had been for tearing down walls. A small hand slipped into hers. "Mama, can I play the flute for Papa when he comes back from the creek?" Vivian looked down into the face of her daughter. Nayland Catherine was 9 years old, with her father's dark, thoughtful eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. In her other hand, she clutched the wooden flute that had once been the sole companion of a silent, solitary man. "Of course, my love," Vivian said, smiling. "I think he would like that very much." A shout of laughter drew their attention to the yard, where a small, sturdy boy of 5 with a mop of unruly black hair was trying to corner a chicken. His name was Doda Har, an Apache word for he who asks questions, but they all called him John Edward, after Vivian's father. He was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, a perfect fusion of his parents' spirits. Mercer appeared, walking up from the creek, his stride as easy and silent as it had been the first day she saw him. He was a man at peace, the deep well of emptiness in his eyes long since filled with the light of a life he had built with his own hands. The scar on his cheek was no longer a mark of violence, but simply a part of the landscape of his face, a line in a story of survival. He smiled as he saw his son, a genuine, easy expression that reached his eyes. He scooped the boy up, setting him on his shoulders, and walked toward the porch. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they sat together, watching the children chase fireflies in the growing dark. The soft, hesitant notes of the wooden flute drifted from Nalen's lips, a simple, searching melody. "Do you ever think of him?" Vivian asked, her voice soft. She did not have to say the name. Voss was a ghost who had long since faded from their daily lives, but his shadow was a part of their foundation. Mercer was quiet for a long time, watching his son try to catch a blinking light in his small hands. "Sometimes," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I think of the world he wanted to make, a world of chains and cages, where everyone had a price and everything was for sale." He looked at Vivian, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a familiar, comforting strength. He thought power was in owning things, land, silver, men. He never understood that true power is in creating things. His gaze drifted over their home, the school, the lights beginning to glow in the windows of their neighbors' houses. He looked at Nalen, her face serene with concentration as she played her simple song. He looked at John Edward, whose laughter was a bright, clean sound in the quiet air. "This," he said, his voice thick with a profound, unshakable conviction, "this is the final answer to men like him. His name is a footnote in a history book. His fortune was scattered to the winds. His hatred is buried in the ground. But we are here. Our children are here. We are living well, and we are loving freely. That is the only revenge that matters. It is the only one that lasts." Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder, the truth of his words settling deep in her soul. He was right. Justice had been served in a courtroom, but the real victory was this. It was the quiet, ordinary, and miraculous peace of this evening. It was the legacy of love and community they had built, a living testament that was more powerful than any monument of stone. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, they stood on the porch, wrapped in the cool embrace of the desert night. The moon was a silver coin in the black sky. From far out in the dark, lonely hills, a wolf called to the moon, its voice a long, hauntingly beautiful cry. A decade ago, the sound might have sent a shiver of fear through her, a reminder of the wild, untamed man she had been forced to marry. But tonight, she felt no fear. She looked at her husband. A slow smile touched Mercer's lips, an expression of pure, unadulterated peace. He was not the wolf anymore. He was Thaddeus. He was her husband. He was Shikei, the one who walked beside her. "It is just a voice," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts, "singing its song to the night. It belongs here, same as us." He put his arm around her, and they stood together, listening to the wild music of the desert. The world beyond their small valley was still full of struggle and prejudice. The bridges they had built were small, and there were many more yet to be built. It was not a perfect ending written in a storybook, but it was a real one. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the hardest chains can be reforged into the strongest anchors, and a bond forced by hatred can, with courage and grace, become a choice made in love. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.